So a reading from Acts chapter 18, verses 1 to 8. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to see them, and because he was a tent maker as they were, he stayed and worked with them. Every Sabbath he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. When Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. But when they opposed Paul and became abusive, he shook out his clothes in protest and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I'm innocent of it. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." Then Paul left the synagogue and went next door to the house of Titus Justus, a worshipper of God. Crispus, the synagogue leader, and his entire household believed in the Lord, and many of the Corinthians who heard Paul believed and were baptized. So Paul leaves Athens on his own and he ends up in Corinth. And if you want to find out more about what he preached there, then have a read of the letters 1 and 2 Corinthians. Now, while he's there, he meets up with a couple. They'd been expelled from Rome and they worked as tent makers, which was Paul's profession as well. And as usual, he goes to the synagogue and he preaches the clear, simple message that Jesus is the Messiah. Now, if we read Paul's letter to the Corinthians, we read a bit more about what exactly he preached. Let me just read to you a little bit from the first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 2, verses 1 to 5. "And so it was with me, brothers and sisters, when I came to you, I did not come with eloquence or human wisdom, as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God. For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you, except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I came to you in weakness, with great fear and trembling. My message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power, so that your faith might not rest on human wisdom, but on God's power." Now, as usual, the message provokes anger and opposition from some of the Jewish people, and to which Paul responds with an odd act. It says, verse 6, "But when they opposed Paul and became abusive, he shook out his clothes in protest." Now that's a reference back to the Old Testament, to Nehemiah chapter 5, verse 13. "I also shook out the folds of my robe and said, 'In this way may God shake out of their house and possessions anyone who does not keep this promise. So may such a person be shaken out and emptied.'" In those days, a robe would gather dust, leaves, debris from the street, would need to be shaken out, to be cleaned. And so this is a symbol that God has shaken them out, got rid of them, their debris, get rid. Then he goes on, verse 6. "Shook out his clothes in protest and said to them, 'Your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent of it. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles.'" Again, this is picking up something from the Old Testament, from Ezekiel chapter 33, verses 1 to 5. I'll read them to you. It says, "The word of the Lord came to me. Son of man, speak to your people and say to them, when I bring the sword against the land and the people of the land, choose one of their men and make him their watchman. And he sees the sword coming against the land and blows the trumpet to warn the people. Then, if anyone hears the trumpet but does not heed the warning, and the sword comes and takes their life, their blood will be on their own head. Since they heard the sound of the trumpet but did not heed the warning, their blood will be on their own head. If they had heeded the warning, they would have saved themselves. That's about a watchman. And a watchman would communicate from the city walls what he saw coming to the people. So if an enemy was coming, he'd blow a trumpet and warn the people. And if the people heard the trumpet but ignored the warning, then their blood would be on their own heads. The watchman, though, he would have done his duty or would now be considered innocent if people died. He'd done his job. Now, Paul here is saying he is like a watchman, and he's proclaimed a warning. That warning, spiritual separation from God. He's saying the Jewish people, they'd heard the trumpet call of the gospel, and they've chosen to ignore it. Paul has done what he was called to do. And so their rejection and separation from God is their problem. Now for us, we are called to faithfulness, not necessarily fruitfulness. Our job, whoever we are as Christians, our calling is to preach the gospel, to do it boldly. That is our job. How people respond is up to God. If we preach, if we tell the gospel, if we tell our family and friends about Jesus, we cannot fail. Failure is when we keep silent. Our job to speak. The response, well, that's up to God. It's up to those people. We've done our job. We cannot fail. We are called to faithfulness, not fruitfulness. So Paul leaves the Jewish people and he goes next door and he worships with Christian believers. And we read that Crispus, the synagogue leader, his entire household, one of the worshippers, is converted and baptized. So our job is to be the watchman, to sound the warning. The Messiah, the Christ, the Saviour has come. And how people respond, well, that's up to them.